They laughed when the old man in the worn red jacket walked onto the shooting range. The instructors exchanged smirks as he approached the firing line, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he set down his small bag. One of them leaned over and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "This isn't a place for you, old-timer. Maybe try the park down the street." The other instructors burst into laughter. The man said nothing. He just stood there with that sad, serious expression on his face, his white beard catching the afternoon light. If you believe respect should be earned through actions, not appearances, remember this story. His name was Thomas, and most people who saw him on the streets of the small town assumed he was just another drifter. At 70 years old, he looked every bit the part. The red jacket he wore over his faded t-shirt had seen better days. His white hair was always neatly combed though, and his white beard was trimmed, even if his clothes were worn. He lived in a small shelter on the edge of town, the kind of place where people went when they had nowhere else to go. Nobody knew much about Thomas. He kept to himself mostly, walking the same routes every day, sitting on the same bench in the town square, feeding pigeons with bread he saved from his meals. He never asked for anything. Never caused trouble, just existed quietly in a world that had long stopped noticing him. The shooting range was new to town, a private facility that catered to enthusiasts and professionals. It had opened 6 months earlier with state-of-the-art equipment and instructors who prided themselves on their expertise. Most were younger men, former military or law enforcement, confident in their abilities and quick to judge those they deemed unworthy of their time. When Thomas had walked in that morning, the receptionist had looked him up and down with barely concealed disgust. The membership fee alone was more than Thomas probably saw in a month or so, she assumed. But Thomas had pulled out exact change from a small envelope, counted it carefully, and slid it across the counter. The receptionist had no choice but to process his day pass, though she did it with a sigh that made her feelings clear. Now, Thomas stood at lane 7, the furthest from the entrance, as if trying to make himself invisible. The range was busy that Saturday morning. Businessmen working on their hobby, off-duty police officers maintaining their skills, competitive shooters preparing for upcoming tournaments. And then there was Thomas, looking completely out of place in his worn jacket and sad eyes. The head instructor, a man named Derek, who wore his former Marine Corps service like a badge of superiority, walked over with 2 of his colleagues. They stood behind Thomas, watching as he carefully unpacked a gun case that looked older than some of the people in the building. The case was battered, held together with duct tape in places, and when Thomas opened it, the pistol inside looked like a museum piece. Derek laughed out loud. "Is that thing even functional?" "You planning to shoot, or just hold it for the memories?" Thomas turned slowly, his expression unchanged. "It works," he said quietly. His voice was soft, almost gentle, the kind of voice that gets lost in crowded rooms. Derek shook his head. "Look, I don't know what you're trying to prove here, but this is a professional facility. We have standards. Maybe you should save your money and spend it on something more practical, like a coat that fits." The other instructors snickered. Thomas looked at Derek for a long moment, then simply turned back to his lane. He loaded the pistol with practiced hands that suddenly seemed steadier than they had before. The laughter continued behind him. One of the instructors made a comment about whether they should call someone, make sure the old man was safe to be around firearms. Another suggested maybe they should just refund his money and ask him to leave. Derek was about to say something else when Thomas raised his weapon. The stance was perfect, feet shoulder-width apart, body squared to the target, arms extended with the kind of form that only comes from thousands of hours of practice. For a moment the instructors fell silent, something in Thomas's posture making them pause. Then Thomas fired. The first shot hit dead center of the target, 50 yards downrange. The second shot followed so quickly, it sounded almost like an echo, hitting within millimeters of the first. Thomas fired 8 more rounds in rapid succession, each one finding the exact same spot, the grouping so tight it looked like a single large hole, When the target was brought forward for inspection, the entire range had gone quiet. People in other lanes had stopped shooting, drawn by the distinctive rhythm of Thomas's firing pattern. When he lowered his weapon and carefully engaged the safety, the silence was profound. Derek stood frozen, his face pale. He walked to the target retrieval system and brought Thomas's target forward. The grouping was impossible. 10 rounds through what couldn't have been more than a 2-inch spread at 50 yards with a pistol that looked like it belonged in a museum. Derek had seen professional competitive shooters who couldn't match that kind of precision. He looked at Thomas, really looked at him for the first time, and something in the old man's sad, serious expression made his stomach turn. "Who are you?" Eric asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Thomas was repacking his pistol case. His movements slow and deliberate, just someone who used to shoot, he said. Derek's mind was racing. That kind of grouping, that stance, the weapon itself. He looked closer at the pistol as Thomas closed the case. It was a Colt 1911, but there was something about it, markings that looked military. Before Derek could say anything else, one of the other range members, an older gentleman who had been shooting in lane 3, walked over. He was staring at Thomas with an expression of disbelief. He pointed at Thomas's hands, at a faded tattoo barely visible on his wrist beneath the worn sleeve of the red jacket. "Are you Thomas Brennan?" the man asked, his voice shaking slightly. Thomas looked up, meeting the man's eyes, and for the first time something flickered across his sad face. "Might be," he said quietly. The other man's eyes filled with tears. He stood suddenly straighter, his hand moving to his forehead in a crisp salute. "Sergeant Brennan," he said, "I served under you in the Gulf. 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines. You saved my life in Kofji." Thomas's expression softened just slightly. He returned the salute with a precision that made Derek, the other instructors, step back. "At ease, Marine," Thomas said softly. "What's your name, son?" The man lowered his salute, tears streaming down his face. "Now, Corporal James Mitchell, sir. I was the radio operator in your unit. You carried me 3 miles through enemy territory after I took shrapnel. I wouldn't be here if not for you." Derek felt like the ground was shifting beneath his feet. He looked at Thomas with new eyes, seeing past the worn jacket and the white beard, past the sad expression and the trembling hands. "Sergeant Brennan," he repeated. Thomas looked at him with those serious eyes. "Gunnery sergeant." "Actually," Thomas corrected quietly. "Retired, 26 years, Marine Corps scout sniper." Mitchell was nodding, wiping his eyes. "He's being modest, sir." Gunnery Sergeant Brennan was a legend. 3 tours in the Gulf, 2 in Afghanistan. He held the record for the longest confirmed kill in Marine Corps history for almost a decade, saved countless lives, received the Navy Cross, 2 Silver Stars, and a Purple Heart. He trained half the sniper instructors in the Corps. The range had gone completely silent. Everyone was listening now, watching this exchange unfold. Derek felt shame burning in his chest like acid. He thought about his own service, his 4 years in the Marines, his pride in being a veteran. And here he had been mocking a man who was a living legend, someone who had done more in a single deployment than Derek had done in his entire career. "I'm sorry," Derek managed to say, but the words felt pathetically inadequate. Thomas just shook his head slowly. "Nothing to apologize for," he said. "You didn't know. Most people don't. Mitchell wasn't done, though." He looked at Derek and the other instructors with something close to anger in his eyes. "Do you know what this man did? Do you have any idea? In Kofji, we were surrounded, cut off from our unit. Gunnery Sergeant Brennan held off an entire enemy platoon by himself for 6 hours while calling in air support and coordinating our extraction. He was shot twice, but refused evacuation until every one of his Marines was safe. He carried me and another wounded Marine, 1 under each arm, through 3 miles of hostile territory. When we finally reached friendly lines, he collapsed from blood loss. They said he should have died. But he survived, recovered, and went right back to training the next generation of snipers. Derek's hands were shaking now. He looked at the target, at that impossible grouping, and understood. This wasn't luck. This was muscle memory built over decades of the highest level training and combat experience. This was a master of his craft, someone who had forgotten more about shooting than Derek would ever know. "Why are you here?" Derek asked. "Why are you living in a shelter? Why are you alone?" Thomas's sad expression deepened. "Life happens," he said simply. "Lost my wife 5 years ago. Cancer. Medical bills took everything. My pension helps, but it's not much. My daughter lives overseas, has her own family. I don't want to be a burden. The shelter is clean, the people are kind. I get by." Mitchell looked horrified. "Sir, you shouldn't be living like that. You're a hero. You should be honored, respected, cared for." Thomas smiled, but it was a sad smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Hero is just a word, son. I did my job, same as you, same as every Marine who served. What happened after doesn't change what we did then. I'm at peace with it." Derek couldn't accept that. He looked at the other instructors, seeing his own shame reflected in their faces. "No," he said firmly. "No, this isn't right. Gunnery Sergeant, would you consider coming back here? Not as a member, as an instructor. We would be honored to have you teach. We could offer you a salary, benefits, a place to stay if you need it. You could train the next generation, share your knowledge." Thomas looked at Derek for a long moment. "I don't need charity," he said quietly. Derek shook his head. "It's not charity, sir. It's recognition. It's giving you what you deserve. And selfishly, it's us getting the chance to learn from the best. Please, consider it." Mitchell was nodding enthusiastically. "I own a security consulting firm, Gunnery Sergeant. I would be honored to have you consult for us as well. Training, curriculum development, whatever you're willing to do. And I have a guest house that's sitting empty. It's yours if you want it. No rent, no strings, just a place for a brother Marine to live with dignity." Thomas's eyes had grown wet, though his expression remained serious. He looked down at his worn red jacket, at his trembling hands, at the pistol case that held a weapon he had carried through multiple wars. When he looked back up, there was something different in his sad eyes, something that might have been hope. "You don't have to do this," he said softly. "We do," Derek replied. "We absolutely do. And we should have done it the moment you walked in. We judged you by your appearance, by our assumptions, and we were wrong. Shamefully wrong. This is us trying to make that right." The other range members had gathered now, listening to the conversation. Several were veterans themselves, and they understood the significance of what was being offered. One of them stepped forward. "I'm a lawyer," he said. "If you need help with VA benefits, pension issues, anything legal, it's yours. No charge." Another spoke up. "I run a clothing store downtown. New wardrobe. On the house. Consider it a thank you for your service." The offers kept coming, each person wanting to help, wanting to show respect to a man they had overlooked or ignored. Thomas stood there, overwhelmed, his sad, serious face struggling to process this sudden outpouring of support. Mitchell put a hand on his shoulder. "You carried us then, Gunny? Let us carry you now. That's what Marines do. We take care of our own." Thomas nodded slowly, unable to speak for a moment. When he finally found his voice, it was thick with emotion. "I would be honored to teach," he said, "and grateful for the help. Thank you. All of you." Derek extended his hand, and Thomas shook it firmly. The shame Derek felt would stay with him for a long time, a reminder to never judge by appearances again. But there was also gratitude that he had been given the chance to make things right, to recognize greatness, even when it came in a worn red jacket and sad eyes. The range erupted in applause. People who had been strangers to Thomas minutes before were lining up to shake his hand, to thank him for his service, to welcome him into their community. Over the following weeks, Thomas's life changed dramatically. He moved into Mitchell's guest house, a comfortable space with everything he needed. He began teaching at the range 3 days a week, and his classes filled up immediately, word spreading quickly about the legendary sniper who was sharing his knowledge. He consulted for Mitchell's firm, developing training programs that were soon adopted by law enforcement agencies across the state. The worn red jacket remained his favorite, but now it was one choice among many in a full closet. The sadness in his eyes never fully disappeared. The loss of his wife, still a weight he carried, but it was joined now by moments of contentment, of purpose, of connection. Derek never forgot the lesson Thomas taught him that day. He made it a point to treat every person who walked into the range with respect, regardless of how they looked or what assumptions might arise. He shared Thomas's story with every new instructor he hired, making it clear that judgment based on appearance had no place in their facility. The range itself changed, becoming known not just for its equipment, but for its culture of respect and inclusion. Thomas's story spread beyond the local community. A regional newspaper ran a feature on the homeless veteran who became a respected instructor and consultant. The article caught the attention of a veterans organization that used Thomas's story to highlight the struggles many veterans face and the importance of community support. Donations poured in, funding programs to help other veterans in similar situations. Thomas became an advocate, speaking at events, sharing his experiences, helping to bridge the gap between military service and civilian life. But perhaps the most meaningful change was personal. Thomas reconnected with his daughter, who flew home immediately after learning about his situation. She was horrified that he had been living in a shelter, angry that he hadn't told her how bad things had gotten. They spent hours talking, healing old wounds, rebuilding their relationship. She visited regularly now, bringing his grandchildren to see him, creating new memories to balance the sad ones. On the anniversary of that day at the range, Derek organized a special event. He invited everyone who had been there, everyone who had witnessed Thomas's incredible shooting and the revelation of his identity. Thomas was asked to give a demonstration to show the next generation what true mastery looked like. He stood at the firing line in his red jacket, the same serious expression on his face, his white beard neatly trimmed. He raised his pistol, that same museum piece that had shocked everyone a year before, and fired 10 rounds downrange. When the target came forward, the grouping was even tighter than before. Perfect, impossible, beautiful. The applause was thunderous. But Thomas just smiled his sad smile, packed his weapon carefully, and turned to the young shooters gathered around him. "Respect isn't about where you've been or what you've done," he told them quietly. "It's about how you treat people, especially those who seem to have nothing to offer you. Those instructors who laughed at me that day, they learned something important, and so did I. I learned that community still exists, that people still care, that it's never too late to find purpose again. We all have value, every single one of us. Don't judge by appearances. Don't assume you know someone's story. And always, always treat others with the dignity they deserve." The young shooters listened, absorbing not just his words, but the weight of experience behind them. They were learning from a master, not just of marksmanship, but of resilience, humility, and grace. Thomas continued teaching, continued sharing his knowledge and his story, continued wearing his red jacket with quiet pride. The sadness never fully left his eyes, but it was accompanied now by something else. Peace, purpose, and the knowledge that he was valued, respected, and home.